morning, everyone. So I'm actually ashamed to say that this is my very first Games for Change festival, but certainly won't be my last. It's an absolutely incredible event, and I'm totally thrilled to be here with you all. So it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Something that Michelle actually just said, that for all the enthusiasm around the learning game space, that the investor voice has largely been unheard or largely underrepresented in the conversations around the learning game sector. So at the very least, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to come here today, sort of throw my voice into the ring, and hopefully have the opportunity to add something to the already incredible conversations that are taking place today, yesterday, and tomorrow as well. So I have a ton of slides to go through, probably way too many slides. I think the conference organizers are going to be really unhappy with me, but I promise I will go through them very quickly, probably at a dizzying pace. And I just want to take the next, 28 minutes or so to talk about my team, how we are looking at this market, the sorts of things that we're seeing, and why we're so excited about learning games as an area for potential investment. It's just a really quick introduction. I think I see a lot of really familiar faces in the audience, which is fantastic to see. But for those I haven't met, I'm a principal at the venture firm GSV Acceleration. I am based in New York City, just up the road, and the rest of my colleagues sit in San Francisco and in Chicago. We are an early stage focused fund, which means we typically get involved in the Series Seed, Series A, and Series B stage. And I also thought it would be helpful to say, just so you kind of understand the lens through which we view the learning game sector. Lots of folks have come up to me already and asked, so do you just focus on games? The answer is actually not at all. Our focus is really entirely on the other side of the coin here. We're focused entirely on learning technology companies. And it's an area that we've focused on really for the last 20, 25 years in a number of capacities, not only as investors, but also as advisors and as operators of companies as well. Just a quick snapshot of our portfolio, 28 amazing companies. We're thrilled to be partnered with all the companies here. And we really do believe, obviously we're biased, but believe that this group represents some of the most dynamic entrepreneurs and companies in this sector, all of whom have set out to transform learning and career outcomes and are doing it at massive scale. Okay, so before we dive into the details and the fun stuff, just thought a great way to start would be to take a step back actually and talk a little bit about why we're here, why we're all here. Obviously as investors, we believe there are opportunities to create scaled learning platforms and to generate returns. But even more importantly, like everyone in this room, we believe in the power of education. We like to say at GSV, we believe education is one of life's most powerful accelerators. And of course, when it works well, we've seen education can drive social mobility, can create opportunity, and can level the playing field. But as important as education is, when it works, it's clearly not working for everyone. So I think the Games for Change Summit is appropriately named. We do need some change in the sector. And of course, despite its importance all across the country, we're seeing scenes that look like this. Students are completely disengaged, and they're falling way behind with alarming consequences. And while we've made great strides in certain areas, like high school graduation rates, which have improved, only 45% of high school graduates today are graduating college ready, which is a pretty shocking statistic. That's from the ACT. And it's no surprise then that college attainment rates nationally are only 18%. This is a slightly different way to slice and dice this data that most people haven't seen. So of the students that complete the 9th grade, only 18% actually go on to graduate from college in the next 10 years. Again, pretty shocking statistic. But even more shocking to me is that even today, a person's zip code, where they're from, their family's income are among the best predictors for how a student will perform academically and beyond. So as an example, low-income students are 5 times more likely to drop out of high school, and students from the bottom income quartile only have an 8% chance of graduating from college. That's pretty stark comparison to students from the top income quartile, who are 75% likelihood of graduating from college. So clearly, it's still a lot of work for all of the people in this room to be doing, and we really think it's about access. In fact, we think that one of the most important issues of our time has become ensuring that everybody has fair and equal access to the future. And we're not so bold as to say that technology is the silver bullet answer to all of the problems, but we really do believe there are technology-enabled solutions to many of the problems that we face, and that those solutions must be introduced at massive scale to see the kinds of change that needs to happen. And I just further say that my team at GSV really does believe that games are going to be critical to this, that learning games are going to be a major force in ensuring that all people have access to the future in the years ahead. So I'm hopeful that you all join me in building and supporting the tools that are going to close some of these gaps and fix some of these problems. So apologies for kind of the depressing statistics. It's not all gloom and doom, of course. There's a lot of good news, not just for us as investors, but I think for everybody in this room. And that's that the market has never been more attractive for learning technology, including for learning games. And this chart really is just to show you that I'm not crazy and that we're not the only ones who are so bullish on this space. We're certainly not alone. So they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This chart, at least to me, is worth a few thousand words probably, and we can talk about it for the next 30 minutes if we wanted to. But I'll just tell you what this chart is showing. This is showing venture and growth capital dollars flowing into education technology companies over the last 20 years, which again is how long my team's been focused on this space. So we see a couple of really interesting themes emerge from here. The first one to point out is in the late 1990s, early 2000s, during the dot-com bubble. Not surprisingly, a number of entrepreneurs and investors were incredibly excited, enthusiastic, that technology was going to come in and radically disrupt and transform education. Of course, that didn't happen, and in fact, the excitement that these groups felt far exceeded the market's ability or willingness to actually change. So the vast majority of companies that got founded in those years failed, of course. In fact, we think, we've done some analysis on this, we think that probably 75%, 80%, even more potentially, of the companies that were founded in this period failed to generate an adequate return to their investors. So investors then did what you'd expect them to do when they lost their shirts. They completely disappeared from the market. And you see here for the next 10 years or so, really a desert as investment capital dollars fell basically to zero for those 10 years. But something really interesting is happening now. And you see over the last handful of years, there's been this sudden explosion of investment capital flowing into education technology companies or learning technology companies. And even more exciting is that the activity is sustained this time around. So things look really different now. And we're routinely seeing over $1 billion of capital actually come into this market every single year. So why is this happening now and why is this different? Well, we like to say there's really been a confluence of catalysts that are shaping the market today and make it so exciting. But a simple way to explain it is a lot of the roadblocks, a lot of the barriers which had historically held this market back and prevented companies from achieving massive scale have started to erode, and many have completely fallen back. So just as an example, there's now a sufficient level of investment capital entering the market, really for the first time, and it's sustained, as we talked about. The quality of entrepreneurs forming businesses in this market has greatly improved over the last handful of years, and far better than it was in that earlier period we talked about in the late 90s, early 2000s. And a number of the roadblocks that have historically held back these markets are related to infrastructure. But today, of course, high-speed internet is commonplace across schools and campuses and in the home, of course. Software has moved off of old dusty servers in classrooms and onto the cloud, mobile devices, tablets, laptops, et cetera, and of course, also ubiquitous. And these things have all been major catalysts for the change that we're now seeing in the marketplace. Something else this change has also really enabled is we're suddenly seeing companies achieve a level of scale that was never possible before. This is a really important point. So just think about it. Before mobile devices, before high-speed internet, and cloud computing were completely commonplace, it would have been unimaginable for a learning company to reach tens of millions of learners. And we're now, of course, seeing that regularly. We're seeing companies, and you can see here, we like to call them weapons of mass instruction, that are very quickly taking advantage of modern technology and actually network effects to quickly and capital efficiently, often with very small teams even, reach massive audiences and make real impact. ClassDojo is just one example, but there are many, many great examples. ClassDojo is a company we're really thrilled to be partnered with at GSV. classroom management tool, really popular application, over 50 million users using ClassDojo. It's in over 90% of K-8 schools in this country, and it's done it in less than 6 years with less than 30 employees, if you can believe it. Duolingo is another great one, also very game-like, so I'm sure everyone in the audience is quite familiar with Duolingo. Also founded in 2011, over 120 million learners on the platform, and just last week raised $25 million at a $700 million valuation, which is, of course, really exciting to see. So as companies are routinely achieving scale now, and this is a pretty new phenomenon, achieving scale in terms of user base, in terms of bookings, in terms of sales, investors and entrepreneurs are finally realizing that exponential opportunities are possible in this space. And of course, it's not just attracting investors, it's also attracting acquirers of edtech assets. This page shows just actually a small sample of the companies that are actively buying up learning technology companies and assets. You see strategic acquirers on the left and financial buyers on the right here. And I've made this chart intentionally impossible to read, although it's a pretty big screen, so some of you can maybe read it. But I think it makes the point really, really clear, and that's that the universe of acquirers these days has never been more robust and has never been more sophisticated. And of course, as these names are coming in and buying edtech assets, it's attracting even more entrepreneurs onto the scene and even more investors, which is creating this really healthy, virtuous circle of activity. So this is my absolute favorite page of the presentation, so I want to make sure I get it across correctly. And what this chart shows is it compares the total value of dollars being invested into education technology companies. That's these small blue bars. And again, we've seen these numbers on the last couple of slides. And it compares it against the total value of exits during the same year. That's just that orange bar. And you can see pretty clearly that the orange bars far exceed the blue bars. So what does this mean? So in the last 9 years, a total of $53 billion worth of acquisition and IPO activity has taken place in the education technology field, and that's all come from just $9 billion of investment capital during the same period. So that's more by a factor of over 6x. And it's not quite this simple, obviously, but I know that if I can put in $9 and get out $53, that's a bet I'm going to take all day. So the takeaway here is really simple. Real value is being created in this sector. And the great misconception, actually long-held misconception, that you can't make money within the education sector is absolutely wrong. So we've been talking a lot about the broader market for learning technology or education technology, but obviously education games are an important part of that ecosystem. And the enthusiasm around education technology has certainly carried over into learning games. I think we've heard a couple of Mary Meeker quotes over the last 2 days, but I thought this one was really great and speaks to the enthusiasm around the learning game space, where she said in her 2017 Trends report, that interactive games represented the motherlode of technology product innovation, which of course is absolutely true. So you're seeing this excitement around learning games in the level of investment activity. Again, several $1 billion has been invested in education technologies over the last handful of years. And each year we're seeing a few $100 million of capital go into learning game companies specifically, which is this small orange sliver at the top. So of course that could be a lot higher, and we do think it will become a lot higher in the years ahead, but still quite robust for the time being. These are just a handful of venture firms that are supporting this space. I would suggest that no one venture firm has really dominated the learning game sector, but clearly lots of venture capital firms have been active around the learning game space, including my team at GSV, Learn Capital, Dreamit, et cetera, really a handful of different groups. But the important point I want to make here is that venture capital firms are not the only ones investing in learning game companies. So I've provided some other capital sources here towards the bottom, but of course there's grant funding, not-for-profits, family offices, angels, and even venture philanthropy. And each of these groups has contributed huge sums of money to support learning game companies. So the point to make is that venture capital isn't the right capital for everybody. And if you're out there looking to raise capital now, or you plan to raise capital in the future, I would implore you to think through each of these different capital sources and think about which is the right one for you, because each different source is going to put a different set of pressures on you as an entrepreneur, as a business owner. So here are just a couple of pockets of investment and innovation we're seeing. I don't want to walk through each of these, but the point to make is that we're seeing all types of companies get funded right now. We're seeing long-form games, short-form games, consumer-focused games, of course, enterprise-focused games, and those covering a range of subject matters, which you see here. And this, again, just really scratches the surface. So this is really, really exciting to see. It's not all happening in K through 12 or in STEM. There are really, really interesting assets being developed in higher education, in the workforce, and addressing lifelong learners as well. So there is obviously a lot to be excited about this space, but it would be wrong not to point out that the learning game sector does continue to face a number of pretty unique challenges. And I think the challenges this sector faces are probably best evidenced by there being a pretty weak market for exit opportunities. Again, if we saw earlier in a couple slides ago that if we zoom back a little bit and just look at the broader market for education technology, that the market for exits has never been stronger there. But again, zooming into learning games specifically, the market is not nearly as robust as you'd hope to see for a market that is this exciting and this big. So here we show the recent acquisition of Jumpstart, Tokoboka the year before it. And again, we are seeing a handful of exits occur each year, but not nearly what you'd hope to see in a healthy and robust market. And really simply, we think that the learning game sector faces a handful of unique challenges. And once those challenges are overcome, and we do think they will be overcome, opportunities for exits are going to open right up. So we think sales and distribution represents just one of those unique challenges. And there are challenges both on the consumer side and on the enterprise side. So for businesses focused I have a B2C approach, of course the App Store continues to be really the most effective way to reach potential customers. And with over 2 billion apps, this is just in the Apple App Store, and another 1,000 being uploaded every day, and with games and education being the most crowded categories of the App Store, investors are, of course, weary of a business where increasing customer acquisition costs and increasing CPI is really almost inevitable. And again, this really favors the bigger game studios, the bigger game companies, not the smaller entrepreneurs and the startups. The enterprise side also faces a number of sales and distribution challenges as well, namely around procurement. So if you're selling into schools, you're selling into districts, or into the enterprise, you know that procurement is slow and it's really expensive, again, favoring the much bigger companies who can afford to do that. This next challenge is, I think, really more of a perception than a reality. It's certainly not something that my team at GSV agrees with, but it is something that we continue to hear from investors, that they have a difficult time getting their arms around the learning game space because they view game companies they view the game sector as a hits-driven market. In other words, you need one giant title to be successful, and of course it's extremely difficult to get there, that there's really no formula for success. And then the last challenge I'll just touch on briefly is this one. And that's that if you look at the ecosystem, it seems like it's missing some of the most obvious players. So the most active game investors, groups like Index, Excel, and there are several others, groups that are really actively investing in consumer game companies. And then the top game companies themselves, like EA Sports, Nintendo, Capcom, again, there are a number of others. Both of these groups have largely been absent from the learning game sector, and hopefully that changes quickly. One really encouraging trend, and it's not shown on this page, is that if you look at the major children's brands and toy companies like Hasbro, like Mattel, like Lego, we do know that as those companies are thinking about their future, reimagining their businesses, moving from, I guess, a physical or analog world to a digital one, that games and digital learning are absolutely top of mind for them. So that, again, is quite an encouraging trend. Okay, so we got some of the challenges out of the way. Now I just want to talk a little bit about why other investors are so optimistic about the learning game space as an area for potential investment. I'll just start with the really easy and obvious ones. The game-based learning sector is huge, any way you slice and dice it. So this page shows that almost $2 billion is spent on learning games every year, clearly dominated by the consumer space today. But the institutional markets of pre-K through 12, and higher education are among the fastest growing, as you can see here, with higher ed actually being the fastest growing space. Also speaking to the size of this market, and again, I think the people in this room are probably quite familiar with these statistics, but there are over 2.5 billion gamers worldwide. Demographics are really interesting and attractive. And just bearing down on education space specifically, there are 50 million students in the K through 12 space. This is in the US. 20 million students in higher education. Any way you slice and dice this market, it's massive opportunity. And we're already seeing encouraging signs that learning games are moving from early adopters towards the mainstream, or sort of crossing that chasm, you might say. So this recent poll showed that over 55% of teachers are using games in their classroom at least once a week. So really this feels like early days, but it does seem like the stigma around using games in the classroom is beginning to erode. In addition to massive audience potential, we see as investors that games also have incredible engagement potential. So of course, we all know that games can demand our attention in a way that very few other things can. This obviously has operational benefits in the form of retention, in the form of monetization, but critically, engagement also has massive educational benefits. So we talked a little bit earlier about disengagement and how that's a huge problem in our schools. Quite simply, it's pretty hard to learn if you're not paying attention. So we need to find a better way to engage learners of all ages, and I'm willing to bet that games are one of the answers there. Other things that investors like to see, learning game companies are highly capital efficient. They can be rolled out really quickly, often around the world with very little localization required. And unlike traditional learning materials, like a textbook, for example, games are testable, and they can be very quickly tweaked or modified to maximize engagement, to maximize efficacy. So here, just really quickly, I want to introduce a framework that my team at GSV has developed over the years, something we like to call the Return on Education Framework. And really simply, companies that demonstrate a return on education are those that do one or all of the following things. They help lower costs to high-quality education, they improve or democratize access, they increase the professional capacity of instruction, and of course, they improve learning outcomes. And the thesis here that we've developed is actually really, really quite simple, and it's this. The companies that demonstrate the highest level of return on education are those that are going to grow the biggest, that are going to grow the fastest, and are going to provide the greatest returns to their investors. So why do I bring this up? Well, really quite simply, because games can provide enormous return on education. And we heard yesterday and we've heard today that there's a mountain of research now that is overwhelmingly positive on the effects of learning games. Games can drive serious learning, which is really, really exciting in our view. And I just thought I would also make a quick comment on consumer and enterprise buyer dynamics. Lots of people talk about Generation X and millennials as being digital natives, which is of course true. But if you look at when these major gaming platforms were launched, you also see that these generations have been gamified since birth. So it's really no wonder then that now as parents and as educators, these groups are far more accepting of bringing learning games into the classroom and into the home as well. So a really positive sign for where this market is headed, we think. So this is just really the last thing I want to discuss. And I do think it's probably a overly basic point, but it is a really important one. And something that we're not just seeing in the marketplace, but something that we're actively looking for as investors in the companies we hope to partner with. And the point has to do with this spectrum here between fun, entertainment, and education. And so for too long, we've seen game developers, we've talked to game developers who try to find an optimal place on the spectrum, trying to determine how they balance these two things. Where on the spectrum should their game fall? But of course, and again, I realize this is obvious, if you're building a world-class learning game, it can't just fall somewhere in the middle. It can't just be a balance of these two things. If you're building a world-class learning game, it absolutely has to be both really, really fun and highly educational. So the right way to look at it is something more like this. Again, appreciate that this is obvious, but I think it's really hard to get this right. And we know it's hard because so many of the companies and so many of the games we see, and we see a lot of them, trust me, fall into the wrong category here. So we see tons of games that are really, really fun to play, but have absolutely zero educational benefit. And on the other side, we see a handful of games all the time that are really educational, but are not at all engaging. So a bit like telling kids to eat their spinach or eat their vegetables. But we're seeing a new class of companies over the last handful of years. We're seeing a new class of companies over the last handful of years which are moving into this top right quadrant and doing so in a really, really special way. And what they're doing is blending these disciplines of entertainment and game science with education, including findings from the leading academic research. And the result of that is that they're creating games that are both highly educational, but also incredibly fun to play. And in fact, in some cases, creating games that are so fun to play that students don't even realize that they're learning or becoming more familiar with really, really challenging subject matters. So it's a trend that we're calling invisible learning, and we're really, really excited about this trend and excited to find companies who exhibit this invisible learning theme. So I have avoided being too prescriptive in this talk. I think that's a really challenging thing to do with such a big and diverse audience. But one thing I can say definitively is if you get this wrong, if you do this wrong, if you aren't able to weave education and entertainment together in a really compelling way in the learning games that you're creating, I'm confident you're going to have a really tough time. It doesn't look like I have time to go through a couple of these examples of businesses we think are doing invisible learning really well. But the point I want to make is that a number of companies have really cracked this equation. And it's no surprise to us that the companies that have found their way into this group have all had a huge amount of success, as you saw from the companies on the last two slides and the companies in this class here. So just 50 more slides. No, I'm just kidding. So really all I have for you today, and I just thought I would end by saying to all the people working in this really important field that you ought to be really encouraged by everything that's happening in this space and the progress that's being made. We at GSV certainly view it as an attractive area for investment, and as you saw, we're putting our money where our mouth is. So I really look forward to, in the years ahead, seeing this market grow and mature even further, and seeing the best learning game companies have really positive outcomes. And of course, if you're building the next great learning game company, please, please come see us at GSV. Would absolutely love to talk to you and work with you. Thanks, everyone.